All right, everyone, I think we're going to get started. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to this virtual program hosted by the Montclair State University Galleries. My name is Alyssa, and I'm the Engagement Outreach Coordinator. Thank you for joining us for our final public program of the semester. Tonight's event features exhibiting artist Joseph Liatela and scholar Tavia Nyong'o in conversation about themes within the exhibition and contemporary performance practices. The exhibition, Nothing Under Heaven by Joseph Liatela, is curated by Jesse Bandler Firestone and correlates spaces of communal experience, such as churches, medical institutions, and nightclubs, where promises of salvation and healing commingle in proximity to loss and grief. This exhibition is made possible in part by funds from the McMullen Family Foundation, the Dolph Gallery and Museum Studies Fund, the College of the Arts, and private contributions. I'd now like to take this moment to read our land acknowledgement statement. We respectfully acknowledge that Montclair State University occupies land in Lenape-Hoking, the traditional and expropriated territory of the Lenape. As a state institution, we recognize and support the sovereignty of New Jersey's 3 state-recognized tribes, the Ramapo Lenape, Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, and Powhatan Lenape nations. We recognize the sovereign nations of the Lenape diaspora elsewhere in North America, as well as other Indigenous individuals and communities now residing in New Jersey. By offering this land acknowledgement, we commit to addressing the historical legacies of Indigenous dispossession and dismantling practices of erasure that persist today. We recognize the resilience and persistence of contemporary Indigenous communities and their role in educating all of us about justice, equity, and the stewardship of the land throughout the generations. I'm now going to introduce our speakers. Joseph Liatela is an interdisciplinary artist based in New York City. Using performance, sculpture, and video, he makes work that examines issues of biopolitics, memorial, trans and queer subjectivities, embodiment, and collective movement. Liatela earned a BFA with distinction from California College of the Arts and an MFA from Columbia University. He has been awarded grants and fellowships from the Zellerbach Family Foundation, Vermont Studio Center, the Banff Center, California College of the Arts, Columbia University, Artist Grant, and was a finalist for the prestigious Found Work Artist Prize in 2021. His work has been shown at Denison Hill, Human Resources Los Angeles, the Monmouth Museum, the Jewish Museum, the Leslie Lohman Museum, Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, PS 122 Gallery, Proyecto Galeria CDMX, among many others. Liatela's writing has been published by the Leslie Lohman Museum Journal and Oxford University Press. Current and upcoming exhibitions include Cultivating at Marley Matsumoto in Sao Paulo, From Confucius to Christ at Yale Gallery in Queens, Last Night at Hotbed Gallery in Philadelphia, the Columbia University Summer Exhibition at Cha Sha Ma in New York City, a group exhibition at Half Gallery in New York City, and a solo exhibition at Montclair State University. He's currently an artist in residence at Smack Mellon in Brooklyn, New York. Okay. Tavia Nyong'o is a critic and curator with a focus on Black performance, queer theory, and contemporary art. His award-winning books include The Amalgamation Waltz and Afrofabulations, The Queer Drama of Black Life. He is chair and William Lampson Professor of Theater and Performance Studies at Yale University and curator for public programs at the Park Avenue Armory. A music nerd of long standing, he grew up listening to rock, funk, disco, acid house, and techno, and had his first formative encounters with performance at 2 a.m. in the club. I'm going to turn it over to our speakers now. Their conversation will be followed by a Q&A, so be sure to drop any questions you have below, and we'll answer it later on. All right, thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Alyssa, and thanks so much for having us here. My name is Joseph Liatela. My pronouns are he, him. I am a white transmasculine person with dark hair, wearing a gray shirt, and with some facial hair.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tavia Nyong'o. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a middle-aged, bald Black man with horn-rimmed glasses and a handlebar mustache, and I'm wearing a black top today. I'm really glad to be here with you, Joseph.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
looking forward to our conversation. I wish it were in person, but I understand it's midterms out there in New Jersey. So we're doing the next best thing, which is broadcasting live from the live from the green room of the View.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I know that we've had so many fruitful and interesting conversations on our own, and I'm really happy to be able to focus and also share what we've both been thinking through in both of our individual research and practices, but also how it relates to the show and also the space of the dance floor as well. So with Nothing Under Heaven, the title comes from a speech that James Baldwin gave in 1963 to the University of Chicago. And to get started, I just want to share a really short clip that gives a little bit of context to where the phrase "nothing under heaven" comes from. Great, it's sharing. Cool. And
now the artist, no matter how he sounds, is by definition a religious man, believing that we can create and transcend all our gods. That it is entirely up to us, with the work of human beings, to make the world more human. This is the demand that the artist makes of his society. Society inevitably, unfailingly, and always resists. Resists because it knows that it could do it, but it prefers to believe that what it can see and touch is more real than what it knows and feels at that moment, for example, when the baby is born. The role of the artist, or responsibility of the artist, is to make you respect that moment above all other moments. To recognize that there is nothing under heaven, nothing under heaven, no creed and no flag, and no cause, more important than the single human life.
We have to talk about those sunglasses though too.
They're really
The
good.
bug eye sunglasses and the cravat. Oh my God, that was James Baldwin knew how to live.
James Baldwin was a Leo, so he knew how to dress.
He knew how to dress and he knew how to live.
Knew how to dress and knew how to live. So yeah, with that speech, I feel like it's really encapsulating a lot of what the work is talking about, but also really what I feel aligned with is what art can do and what I hope to do as an artist in my own practice. Yeah, because you listened to it recently, so
Yeah, you gave it. I mean, you sent me the link, and yeah. First of all, I would say that Baldwin has been very formative for me, to say the least, and both his, although oddly I came to his novels a bit later than his biography. I read a biography of Baldwin when I was a teen, essentially, and I was always sort of taken by the example. He was living basically what he's talking about there, and in the speech that he started out as a child preacher, right? And so he's always coming out of that Black tradition of the tradition of Black theology and the sort of sermon as social commentary, right? And so both this idea of the morals, he says earlier on that speech something like, the moral responsibility of the artist, which is a topic he was given, to talk on, was, he always understands that as social, right? And it's so for you, there's a lot of Catholic imagery, and in the work, there's also a lot of, we're going to get into it in the conversation, right, about the tensions with religiosity and the sacred, and how your work makes space for trans and queer subjects within within a set, within a tradition, within an institution that doesn't always affirm us.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think sort of expanding this idea of the sacred is really important to me, because I think, there's a lot of sort of themes that are being woven into the work, whether it's the afterlife, the spiritual, spaces of gathering, loss, haunting, but also salvation, right? And I'm just going to go to the next image, which is a photo from Kevin McCarty that was in Jose Esteban Muñoz's book, Cruising Utopia. And I feel like this is really encapsulating so much about what the show is about, and also what I'm sort of thinking through. I'm not necessarily trying to, include queer and trans subjects into the institution of the Catholic Church. In my opinion, the Catholic Church has committed a lot of, crimes against humanity, and it's not necessarily something I'm trying to like assimilate into, but I am interested in expanding this sort of definition, or traditional definitions of like the sacred, or who gets to go to heaven, right?
And there's so many names, just because your focus has been on nightlife, and we're looking at this Kevin McCarty image of salvation, heaven, but also I suppose purgatory, like really a lot. But whether, even if it's like hell, right? There's this sense of the way religiosity and the and spirituality and the sacred suffuse nightlife, right? And it reminds me of something that Robert Septo always used to say. He was one of my mentors in graduate school, that there's in the Black tradition, there's nothing closer than Saturday night and Sunday morning.
Okay.
Given that we are often ending up leaving the club on Sunday morning.
Yeah, and even these sort of traditional,
or Sunday afternoon.
Depending on, I mean, and there's even going to church is such a like kind of tongue-in-cheek phrase of going to the queer bar, right? Or
is that so?
Yeah, going to church.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. So I think there's like, a lot of parallels here. And also, outside of the club, like a lot of, obviously, our social structures are so mimicking these ideas of, particularly Catholicism and punishment, and, viewing God as this sort of like daddy figure that is watching you and either doling out blessings or doling out punishment based on your behavior, and I think that sort of ideology, especially in this country, is responsible for so much of the world we live in, and a lot of that is harmful.
Before we move to the next slide, I just want to say about this image, the sort of empty stage series is by the artist Kevin McCarty, and Jose Munoz writes about it in Cruising Utopia. And it's both about the before and the after of the performance. And your piece, which we're going to look at, is definitely speaking to the sort of aftermath, right, of nightlife, but also in Munoz's analysis, stages is kind of like a pun on the idea that like queerness is like a stage, right, and that nightlife is escapist, right, or not important, and because there's some larger like straight time that it's irrelevant to, right?
Mhm.
So there are like multiple layers in this particular image, which is part of it, again, part of a series of photos of nightclub stages.
Mhm.
Did you know this series when you were coming up with your work? Was that?
Yes, so Cruising Utopia has really informed a lot of my work, but particularly for my thesis work, working with an empty stage. For my thesis, I created this stage that was empty, that was activated by performers who will also be joining us on the call tonight. I'm very excited to have Chris and Hector on. But that was sort of born out of that essay stages and talking about the empty stage. I work a lot with absence and the space in between things in my work. I think there's so much potential there. And also, you know, Munoz talks about the empty stage at a queer bar being the space that's both implying absence, but also queer potential, right? Anything could happen. A performance is about to start, like you're saying.
Mhm.
And I'm interested in this sort of overlap between absence and loss, right? Implies both loss and potential, and sort of how those things are happening in the same time of these spaces of gathering, but also at the same time can be these spaces of loss and absence, right? When we think about the dance floor.
Should we look at
Yeah.
Untitled?
Yes. So the first piece we have here is titled Untitled, in parentheses that says salvation is a collective gesture. I know that we are all here at the same time. That title is sort of a moderation from a quote from the text, the spiritual text, A Course in Miracles, where it talks about salvation being a collective endeavor, but wanting to sort of bring in the aspect of performance and dance into that language. And so this piece is a granite tile dance floor. And that also has that sort of double meaning of, you know, it's a dance floor that you could see, you know, in clubs, but it's also, you know, granite is also used in funerary spaces.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this project was born out of my thesis research, which was based off of like the dance floor in the nightclub, and more specifically, the Pulse Orlando shooting.
2016.
In 2016, yes. Yeah. And so there are 49 lilies are suspended in the space, and there's a sound component by Anthony Servaldine, who's my collaborator, with recordings of different dance floors across New York City. Yeah.
Yeah, the first version of this at your thesis show, and where you walk into the space and it's a frontal encounter with the stage. In that case, was elevated, but you know, quite struck by the use of the flowers and the counting each lost life in that particular tragedy, which was, you know, many things to say about it, including the significance of targeting Latin night in particular, and how Black and Brown, but also the relationship between that particular community and the kind of Catholic or Latin, you know, Church of Rome, like communities adjacent to the Church of Rome, into which we could think about, you know, Italian American as well. But really the thing that struck me, you know, still kind of, you know, strikes me about the piece is I was in Germany at the time. I was in Berlin, and you know, it was the only time, I'm sure it was not the only time that happened, but it was the only time that I saw the whole nightlife community gather in the daytime in in front of the Brandenburg Gate, which anyone who's been to Berlin knows it's like, I mean, I guess it would be like going to Union Square, you know, and it was very moving. It was so tangible how much like how the global, you know, there are only so many times that I feel like the global something like a global queer community exists at all, right? You know, and that was one of them. And so I always remembered that. And clearly you're from a different generation than me, but you also, and also not from Florida, you know, it's like, what does it mean that we're all kind of this, as it were, second line? You know, if you think about the New Orleans funeral form, in which the first line is the designated mourners and the family, right? And the second line is this, it's like, is those who somehow are brought into the process of memorialization.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about like collective grief and how like the effects of pulse didn't just happen you know, in Orlando. It did ripple outwards, right? And I think, you know, when we think about shared grief or grief as like a collective responsibility to tend to, I think that that can really shift the way that we remember and move forward and are able to move forward if we actually tend to that responsibility. But, you know, I think similar to memory, where it's sort of something that's put onto some people and other people have the privilege of like forgetting or like not carrying that burden. I think it is really important to talk about that. My friend and amazing artist Indira Allegra talks a lot about grief equity, which I think is really amazing and interesting. But yeah, I actually wanted to read a quote from Ghostly Matters from Avery Gordon. And it says, "To be haunted in the name of a will to heal is to allow the ghosts to help you imagine what was lost that never even existed, really. This is a utopian grace, to encourage a steely sorrow laced with delight for what we lost that we never had, to long for the insight of that moment in which we recognize, as in Benjamin's profane illumination, that it could have been and can be otherwise," right? And I think like when we think about that sort of echoing outwards, but also like dispersing that type of gravity, right? We're trying to sort of do that in the exhibition where it's like.
But before we go on, I just, because there's something in there that, you know, it's, you said about the tending to grief, and one of the things about Untitled that's so moving is the inclusion of live orchids, and the need to tend to them, and to, you have a whole ritual or a time, you know, there's a, you call it ritual, whatever, you know, in which the docents in the gallery do replace, I mean, on the schedule at least, right? They're replacing the flowers, and that makes me think of any number of things, including the placing of flowers on graves and that sort of, you know, but also at sites of collective grief. You know, I can't remember now, but I'm sure there were flowers laid out in Berlin, right? In that, as of course there were in Orlando and in New York City. But also, again, to touch on Munoz and the idea of like the evidence of ephemera, it's really striking how there are these traditions in, you know, contemporary art for performance and conceptual practices, which the art object itself is not as important as the set of relations that are set up around it, right? You know, and so like the instruction pieces that Yoko Ono or Felix Gonzalez Torres, you know, and this is a sort of, I mean, I read it as in that lineage of being an instruction piece, right? You know, but the instruction is also very specifically about, you know, tending to the memory of a particular loss. And to, I like the fact that in this version of it, to replace the flowers, you're stepping onto the dance floor, where you have a very interesting quote on it. What does that say?
To move is to remember.
To move is to remember.
Yeah, I think you know, so how it works is we the student museum educators who've been amazing, like every Thursday during open hours, it's not when it's closed, it's intentionally part of the programming, change out the flowers, and it's sort of this whole care process, right? And then different sort of student groups have been coming through to participate, including I think a student grief support group as well. And like, you know, it's on the dance floor, and we're having a lot of programming on the dance floor as a sort of site that all these different things can happen, which field is really exciting, and it's great to be able to have it at a university where this can happen, or an institution. And so yeah, having that sort of being that something that's kept alive, right? And
Even as it's dying, right?
it's dying.
And also one of the things about dying, just to nerd out a little bit on the aesthetic form, but a friend of mine is a florist, has talked to me about like how you're supposed to clip lilies because of the pollen, will drop as it dies, and but that itself is, it's a cycle of life, whatever, but in this case, it kind of falls onto the panels, the ceramic panels, or the granite panels, and you employ it as one of the we'll see those panels later on, in which you're using both the pollen and also prints of the orchids in the composition.
Yeah. So like going back to ephemera as evidence, like the things that are left behind, it's a really important part of the work. And also, like queer history or lineages, like if your history isn't taught, looking to these traces in order to weave together, like, and locate oneself within a larger collective history. Backwards. Okay. And so I guess at this point we can move on to this piece, which is aluminum railing that I built, and a painting by Carlo Dolci from 1660.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was such an amazing opportunity to be able to work with the university's collection. And
there's a Warhol in the exhibit too, which we'll see. Okay.
Yeah.
But tell me about this particular painting of the Archangel Gabriel and what it means to you.
Sure. Yes. So here we go. So with Archangel Gabriel, I actually saw this on a site visit with the curator, Jesse Bandler Firestone. And I was looking at the different locations, and they just happened to have a bunch of like Catholic art up in one of their sort of like smaller window galleries. And I pointed out, and I was like, oh wow, Archangel Gabriel, the Archangel of Artists, always depicted holding lilies, who has also been shown as like different genders across time and religious art, including in the Quran. And so is sort of lovingly referred to as the transgender angel, with having these sort of different fluid depictions over time. I went to Italy over the summer, and I saw so many Gabriels everywhere, and the variation, even within the Vatican, was so incredible to be able to see, how did this get through? Right?
Yeah.
Like this is all here at the same time, where it's like maybe a more like obvious depiction of a certain gender, and one that's very fluid, and one that's like completely different, and it's somehow within the walls of the Vatican, which is like, to me, pretty amazing.
Angels are pretty radical, There's a reason why they're often the objects of religious syncretism in the Afro-diasporic world, and the thinking even about, like I didn't know that, I didn't know much about representations of Gabriel, but this particular one, it is definitely androgynous, the divine androgyne, and I guess it bespeaks a sort of complicated relationship of the church to queerness, and also to gender nonconformity, and even transgender. I guess part of me wants to ask a question about how that might relate to some of the BDSM imagery we'll see later on, but insofar as there's something about submission and ritual and transformation. But also, before we get there, I'm curious about the work, because this is the go-go. Tell me a little bit more about the sculpture. It's the railing of it's a railing. It's modeled on the railing from Pulse.
Yeah. So in part of my research, I was looking at the actual interior of the club, what it looked like inside, and also really inspired by, this is stages, right? And so while I was looking at images of the interior, I saw this empty go-go stage inside that was elevated and had this sort of like banister railing in it, and decided to recreate it, without a bottom, something that, isn't necessarily going to support like a physical body. And then pairing it with Gabriel in this way, I mean, I think going back to this idea of like what's considered sacred, right? But also thinking about go-go dancers as, these overlookers of the dance floor, right? They're on these elevated platforms, overlooking all of us and keeping the energy going, but also there's sort of like like, dare I say, heavenly, if you think about the church pulpit, right, you're looking up at Jesus. If you think about the dance floor, you're looking up at the go-go dancer. And so pushing this idea of like what gets to be considered sacred.
No, definitely. And what I was going to add to that about, no, I think you basically said it, that that the go-go boy is a go-go dancer. Oh, I know, I was going to say, so Adrian Piper was a go-go dancer in the 70s or late 60s, and incorporates that in a number of her later works of art, including the Mythic Being series. And although she doesn't go and reenact being a go-go dancer, she does this whole complicated, I digress, but she reimagines that experience, which in my book, if anyone cares, it's like I argue it's not actually, I'm not claiming that she's a trans person, but there's something, I mean, but the Mythic Being might be trans, right? There's certainly this very elaborated effort of projection and empathy, which also I think connects to your work, Joseph, how you're encouraging your audience, or maybe I'll turn this into a question: to what degree do you think of this exhibit as creating a context or supportive environment for trans and queer youth or visitors, people of any age, and to what degree is it perhaps also encouraging empathy for a world that some people may not want to be involved in, either because they're too normcore or I don't know, like they're too religious. I mean, it's hard to say like why, or they just don't like loud noises or something. You always do meet queer people who are like, I don't like to go to out, but is there also a kind of pedagogy there for people who do maybe need kind of greater empathy for nightlife, for and people who work in nightlife?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of going back to that line of James Baldwin's speech, where he talks about people wanting to rather believe in what they can see and touch than what they know and feel to be true. I think, what I'm aiming to do with this exhibition is to materialize what I know and feel to be true. And I think that often might not align with a lot of what we're told is true, or what we're told is possible, right? And I think it's so important to stay true to that, because it's like I feel like I'm at this point in life and in my practice where I'm not really concerned as much around convincing or like not seeming crazy or seeming wild, or it doesn't belong to have like this club setting in a gallery. It's like if I was concerned about that, about what other people thought was true versus what I knew to be true, like I would not exist as a trans person. So like I think with this, and one of my favorite things about being an artist, right, is that taking what you know and feel to be true and then making it material reality. And I think also that trans people are such masters at this in certain ways, right? Like we know ourselves, we envision our bodies, and then we make it real. And and in that world, like in very much also queer and trans lineage and community, like I think, mutual aid and care is central. And so it's not something I'm like necessarily setting out to foster empathy or setting out to like teach something, but I think it's more about making work about my own experience and what I know to be true, and also, yeah, a version of the world that I want to exist. It's been incredible to hear from some trans students on how this has, like, the work has affected them. And to me, that's like everything, like if that is it, then that's everything to me.
Although
But
unfortunately, we have to live in a world with these other people as well.
yeah,
A little empathy and support from them would be good too.
yes.
Do you want to look at this? Makes me want to look at the next piece, which I think might be. Oh, are we going to see some images of the performance? I was gonna maybe talk about the waiting room piece, which is
Yeah, we can skip ahead to that.
just to make, we could come back to,
Okay.
just like on that
Step here. Okay.
so well, it's also, I mean, since we were talking about Adrian Piper, it's interesting that in this shot, at least, we have a chair in that same position of being in a corner, and being kind of placed in a position of having to kind of tell the right story to an authority figure in order to receive the care you need. And but at the same time having the as you say, like trying to make the world that you want to live in, or that you need to. Do you want to say something about how the shibari rope work fits into this particular version of corner and its significance for that that sort of trust fall into a body and like a world that you would find habitable?
Wow, trust fall into a body. It's it's nice. Yeah. Sure. I'll do here we go. We can see it. So yeah, like thinking about these overlaps of restriction, right? I think an endurance, but also finding pleasure and embodiment and connection within systems that are harmful or oppressive, but that you need to rely on, in the world that we live in. And so when thinking about like the medical industrial complex, in my experience, just being a trans person, needing to access hormone replacement therapy, and sort of the process of going through that, and also our medical system being a globally oppressive, problematic structure, right? Even if we think about the history of like birth control in Puerto Rico, or like testosterone is manufactured in Israel, it's like that's very inspired by the work of Michelle O'Brien, who wrote this essay called Tracing This Body: Transsexuality, Pharmaceuticals, and Capitalism. And she talks about like locating her body within these different flows of capital and law and border. And it's like, yeah, you're in that. Or if you're an HIV positive person, you're in that. If you're a drug user, you're in that. But how do you find connection and embodiment and pleasure in those systems? I think being embodied is one of the most pleasurable things about being alive. So
and just to say, is there another image of this? I agree with what you're saying, that as Michelle O'Brien and indeed others, I would think of Paul Preciado, who've had, who kind of linked, C. Riley Thornton, for sure, thinking about the racial genealogy of gender medicine, but anyways, the medicine of gender. And, but I was thinking it just from the idea that, when you mentioned the need to, for instance, hormone replacement therapy or any particular form of medical care, that there's a way in which, we might be able to argue, that if trans, if and when trans people are able to receive adequate care, that, or how to put it away, no one will have received adequate care until trans people receive that care, right? You know, so rather than, I think I stress that because like in some cases there's this implication that sort of trans care is a privilege, right? Just as actually medical care, period, is often seen as like a privilege in this country at least, and it actually is it is a privilege, right? It's connected to work, it's connected to wealth, it's connected to having a formal relationship to an institution that provides it. You know, it's rather than what it should be is a right. So I think this idea, that goes back to trans liberation in the 70s, that free medical care on demand. That is like, that's actually not something special or particular to trans people, but the kind of minimum condition for everyone, right? Including trans people, because trans needs for medicine extend beyond, right? Gender affirming care, right?
Absolutely.
Everyone gets colds.
Everyone gets colds. Yeah, they call it trans broken arm syndrome when you go to the doctor and you're trans and it's for something completely different, but they start to try and pin it on the hormones or something. It's like when you have a broken arm and they're like, oh, the kids are HRT. It's like, no, it's no, totally. And I think, that obviously, Black liberation and trans liberation are so connected, particularly when we look at the medical industrial complex and how it's done harm and how those conditions sort of like create it to be possible for those two things to exist, right?
As is shown in the next piece, the DSM, tell us about what factors go into making this piece, starting with what that book is.
Sure, maybe you can do a close-up. So this piece on being an idea, it's actually inspired by Preciado, but it is the DSM-4 that is tied with the same shibari rope that is sort of laid out to mimic a reclining figure abstractly. And the DSM-4 is the previous version of the DSM. It's currently discontinued. It was discontinued, I think, in 2013. And it was the most previous version that had the diagnosis gender identity disorder in it. And then with the renewal, it was now gender dysphoria disorder, I guess. But yeah, just thinking about how wild and strange it is that we live in a world that like the arrangement of someone's physical form can constitute a psychological diagnosis. To me, that's really interesting.
Yeah. No, it's and problematic.
And
right?
problematic, yeah, of course.
In a lot of, but what's I mean, there's so many things to say about this piece, starting with the resemblance of the stacks of books to something like a body. In fact, it is, I think did you mention it? This is the same as your body weight?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you've taken your body weight full worth of these books, and that oscillation between a subject and a set of diagnostic codes, and but also the another nod to Felix Gonzalez Torres and For Ross. Is that the piece? The candy the candy scatters. And that but also another stage, right? In some versions of this, there's a pulsating red light beneath it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's go back to.
Oh, we were supposed to end there. I see. Okay, let us all go out. But there was a connection there was a method there, right? One was to think about. I mean, I was thinking about how how could both. I mean, you said it's important to have like a trans student write to you and experience the exhibit in a way that is enabling in some fashion, and as a like a non-trans person, I also learn a lot about the trans experience through the exhibit and through the particular aesthetic decisions that you've made. So that is, maybe I'll call it empathy, or since we're now moving to the particular dance piece, could also think about touch, right? And how we are touched by other people, which is both, I think we're about to say, both about like arrows and, but also risk, and even, you know, when I think about dance was, and I think about, you know, you're kind of, this is kind of collective agreement to be uncomfortable to some degree, you know,
Sure.
which is why I always personally, I'm old school, I admit, like a little bit. I mean, I understand the idea behind safe spaces, but I'm always like, you can only promise so much on a dance floor, right?
Sure.
You know, but tell us, tell me more about this particular piece, which and who the dancers are, and how they experienced this performance, which, as we were talking earlier, is both dance and not dance, or something you know, adjacent, in terms of what they're moving through.
Absolutely. So I've been very, very blessed to work with Chris Tabassi and Hector Sarna on this piece called To Move Is to Remember. We initially started working together for my thesis to do a piece about pulse together. They're, you know, trained dancers, incredible at their craft, and they're also a couple. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about the process when we bring them on, which I'm very excited to have them. Yes, of course. Okay. And so in this space, they would be sort of performing these choreographies that are referencing, you know, modern dance, but also movements that you see in the club, and slowed down, like really slowed down, and activating also the go-go dancing reeling as well, and moving with each other on the dance floor. Yeah, thinking about these ideas of traces and ephemera, like we were talking about, they have the same gold pigment on their hands that are in some of the paintings in the show. And so we start with a flat black like wall, and then after there are all these traces left by them afterwards that are this like gold pigment as well. Yeah, and here's more images of them.
Again, just another nod to, I'm sorry, I'm doing all these like historical references tonight, you know, but one of the strategies that Gonzalez Torres used was to have objects that the you know, that audiences could interact with, right? You know, a stack of you know, a stack of paper, right? You know, or the candy spills, indeed, you know, and to have, not that there's those interactive pieces in your show, but the dancers are interacting with the piece, and itself, and the presence of the live flowers endows the whole thing with a very, I think, strong sense of temporality.
Yeah. And I think, you know, time works so differently, particularly on the dance floor, right? Like if we think about a place, a dance floor that's been around a long time, like Julius Bar, for example, the oldest gay bar in New York City, you could walk in.
We're gonna hold this conversation.
We're going to try and hold this conversation, but maybe another time. And you know, we think about Julius, and you could walk in there, and it's like many different decades. Like it could be many different decades when you walk in there, for better or for worse, right? And there's so much residue in these spaces of time. And I also very much believe, you know, even in the title of this work, I know that we're all here at the same time, you know, like that there are sort of, for lack of a better term, like spirits dancing with us, right? You know, Pamela Sneed, who did a reading last week on the dance floor, amazing, you know, author, artist, legendary, iconic, also my mentor. You know, she talked about not being able to go to Fire Island for years after the height of the AIDS crisis because there were too many ghosts on the dance floor. And I think when we think about movement and memory, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this with performance and embodiment and time. But we think about the gesture that comes from a place of, if it's from trauma, it's like referencing something that already happened.
Mhm.
I know you've also been thinking about music in Utopia, music being citational of a different time that was recorded. It can take us back to a different time as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's true. I mean, there's so many layers to that. Maybe starting with music and then picking up what I can gather. It's so my own generation, not to cast aspersions or to make like a huge generalization, but my sense is that we were less reverential towards our elders than your generation is, which works out conveniently for you. It's like an aspirational elder, but I think I remember when I was young, I probably would have thought, oh, that Julius was, God's waiting room or something. I didn't think it as a space for me and or people my age. And I think that was definitely my loss in some ways, or in a lot of ways. And I had other spaces that were intergenerational, primarily the academy actually, but one way or the other, whether it's academy or dance or a bar, like intergenerational space is so important for queer and trans communities. It's for everyone, but I think especially trans communities, like needing, as Cecilia was saying last week, like someone needs to like take you by the hand and be like, welcome to your life, right? And it's usually not going to be your birth family, however supportive they are, right? For someone who hasn't walked in their shoes. But it's like a long-winded way of saying, in answer to your question, that the other thing about my generation is that we were all collectively traumatized by I'm actually at the age that I did not have a lot of my immediate friends die, but the generation that was immediately older than me, who would have like shown me like what's what in the game, that was gone, right? So I feel like an AIDS orphan. I was sort of like orphan, not entire, but like there was a lot of and we talk even about epigenetic trauma or the transmission of intergenerational transmission of a trauma, right? And I think part of that, and Pamela's work has been so good in this, is thinking about those who survived, right? Who cared for those they lost and continued in so many different ways to both individually, whether it's artists whose work is being brought back to life, so to speak, or brought back to the public today, or I think as in this piece and in your work in general it's not like you said something earlier, like it's not like you're creating a nightclub in the gallery at Montclair State, but you're looking at you're offering space for the losses, but also the potentiality in to be in one place. So it is like a three-dimensional interactive empty stage is maybe how I would think about it now.
Yeah, I think the dance floor and the nightclub is where a lot of us gather. And I think yeah, I guess my question for you is thinking about Utopia and loss is such a part of life that everyone experiences, right? It's just a part of being a human. It's sort of like the cost of entry of living this life, right? And our proximities to loss are vastly different depending on like how we're impacted by white supremacy or classism or things like that, of course.
But also just the loss of, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think just like the loss of the sense of plenitude, right? Like the condition, this is like Freud's insight, the condition of becoming, a subject is the loss of a kind of primary oceanic attachment that's often ends up being connected to the mother, to the parental figure, the nurturing figure, and if but also just more generally to a time prior to separation, right? And that's itself already lost, right? And then on top of that, the loss of well, ask your question, sorry, but I just wanted to throw that in there too.
Yeah, there's many types of grief and many types of loss, small and large. But yeah, it's like, how do we think about, if we're thinking about utopia and hope, it's like, how do we think about a version of utopia that unfolds this sort of guarantee in life, right? Like, how do we think about dealing with loss in a utopic way? And that's sort of what I'm thinking about with this. Like, we don't have, like, as queer and trans people, we don't have a lot of spaces that are quiet and meditative to be able to reflect on loss, right? The nightclub has sort of been standing in for that, but it was never supposed to be that, right? It's like someone dies and there's another function, like we go. And so I think, like how can we start to envision ways of like doing that grief work that are in ways utopic? Because I don't think that's something that's touched upon a whole lot with talking about utopia, because obviously, like, no one wants to go there, obviously. Like, a lot of people don't want to.
Well, I don't know. It's like, what are we talking about when we're talking about utopia? In the sense that, we could be here all night in terms of the, what it means as a word, but also I think there's unfortunately, again, as Jose said, shouting utopia down is an easy move, right? That is very, and like why that is the case, I've been doing some of my own academic writing on that. It's why is it so easy to shout down utopia? Because either people are thinking that it is some kind of totalitarian imposition of one person's scheme for the world on everyone else, right? So the people who are, like the critics of quote unquote woke, it's a word I think is quite, racist actually, but the people who criticize like political correctness, right? Or they would think of themselves as criticizing this kind of like utopian idea of like that's really actually dystopian. And then the other, I think, way in which people talk about utopia is as escapism, right? And as something that there is a lot of it's beyond respectability politics, but I would say just Christian moralism in the bad sense, that you're not supposed to. I mean, I know, like, for instance, this, I was talking with someone about an activist group that that had this conflict where after like a 60-minute Zoom call, after talking about like, whatever shit we had to talk about, right? They were like, okay, so now we'll play some music and have a party, and someone on the call had a problem with that. It's like, well, how dare you, like how dare you enjoy yourself? Like when, it's just like disrespectful to the, it's like, really? Like, like you're not going to allow yourself. It's like, so those two sorts of, I think, misunderstandings of what utopia is, either that it's, this like self-flagellating, basically Christian denialism of pleasure and of the basic need for self-care and all the other things that make like nightlife and outer space, right? Or this idea that you're somehow imposing this on you're imposing on your utopian ideas on society, whereas just to be kind of, and this I really learned from the work of Jana Brown, and it connects a lot to your questions about music in her book Black Utopias. She really talks about like the music of other worlds and how there's a long tradition. She focuses on the Black feminist, like genealogies of building utopias going back to like spiritual seekers in the 19th century, like Sojourner Truth, for instance, who was both an abolitionist and deeply involved in a variety of utopian religious communities, one of which we will talk about later, kind of a cult, Kingdom of Matthias, but she escaped. The good news is she escaped,
Okay.
right? So she escaped from, the cult leader every day. But that perpetual like seeking and sojourning, which I think so many queer and trans people today I see are like really, it's like sort of replacing patriarchal religion and like white supremacist theology, but replacing with something that is more more supportive. I can see already that we've moved on to a piece that kind of talks about that. So let's talk about devotion and it's just consecration.
Consecration,
Yes,
yes.
consecration.
So this work is sort of like blending these ideas of the afterlife, the sacred. So this is a monstrance from the 1800s. A monstrance is a Catholic religious item that's usually to hold the Eucharist, which is symbolic of the body of Christ. I was raised Catholic, but if you haven't been, like, it's when the priest holds up the wafer and like blesses it.
I was not raised Catholic, but I went to Catholic school and I was obliged to go. I know, thank you. I was obliged to go to mass, but I was denied communion because I wasn't Catholic, and so I have host envy.
It's really gross.
It's really gross. I'll never know.
Yeah,
I imagined it tasted like Pringles. That was my fantasy.
That's generous of you. No, the Catholics are not allowed that level of pleasure. Yeah, it's. I mean, going back to this idea that it's bad to feel good, right? It's like that's infiltrated so many. Oh, I think we're probably running short on time.
Yeah,
we are.
I'm just popping in the conversation once. I think about 15-20 minutes left, so we can save some time to answer some questions that have appeared if we want to bring the dancers in to talk a little bit more.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's move to questions.
Yeah, let's move to questions, and we can bring in Hector and Chris.
Sure. Well, a question for Tavia is, what is your opinion on the recent revival of disco and Black gay ballroom culture in the music and entertainment industry?
There's been a revival. I mean, did it ever go away? So I think if I understand the question, it might have something to do perhaps with the recent release of Beyonce's Renaissance, and I think a little bit less successfully, but still noteworthy, Drake's latest album, which also was a tip to Black queer dance music cultures. And I mean, say what you will about appropriate or whatever, or recognition, I would say, these days I feel like we need all that friends that we can get, so I'm prepared to like go with, and in terms of rediscovering disco, I've always, I always love nightlife, or sometimes they're not even nighttime. Like, so Soul Summit is a long-winded answer, but Soul Summit is like a party that happened on a Sunday afternoon in Fort Greene Park for the better part of a decade. And, I lived in that neighborhood. I'd always go there. It was like everyone, from grandmothers to infants, and it was a Black queer centered space that was open to everyone and free, and on a Sunday afternoon in the park, right? That's almost like again, I don't know, call it, it's not a utopia, and of course, but like there's definitely a utopianism in that, in Soul Summit, and part of that is the, it's funny though, like I have a friend who lives in the neighborhood, and he's like, oh, I can't go to that and hear those same old songs for like the 100th time. Like, he's like such a aesthete, that he's like offended to hear like all this old music, and he actually wants to hear, I don't know, PC or whatever, the latest music. And so I'm kind of in between, I obviously like to hear what's happening new today, and not a huge fan of just sort of slavishly or mechanically repeating sounds from the past because that sounds cool or something, you know, I would, but you know, a kind of, you know, meaningful homage to the past and a kind of repetition with a difference is always exciting for me, you know. And so I think just even like some of the vibe of disco, you know, it's almost both the music but also the clothing and the orientation towards dancing.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that, you know, and a kind of dancing that's you know, very elegant but also languid, and it's like it's not it's I like it. I'm in favor of the disco revival.
Great, thank you. And Joseph, do you feel like there are enough exhibitions or just spaces in general discussing the topics that Nothing Under Heaven is looking at, or do you feel like there's kind of a lack?
Oh, I would like to see more. I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. But yeah, I don't really know of many and I don't mean this I don't really know of many exhibitions that
Yeah,
talk
well,
about this, right?
I was going to ask, you know, just a way of reframing that question is, you know, are there, you know, if you say, are there enough LGBTQ like museums and galleries, the answer is like, obviously no, because
No.
there's like almost none of them. But there's also another way of like, should like trans and queer art and culture not be everywhere, right? You know, like you kind of found it at the Vatican, you know.
I did.
And you know, it should be everywhere, right? So how do you balance those two kind of impulses in terms of you know, prioritizing maybe in terms you could talk about in terms of where you want your work to be seen and the contexts you would like to travel as an artist?
Oof, this is so tricky because I feel like it comes down to that question of like, what is trans art? And I'm really not, personally, I'm not for like the canonization of trans art.
Mhm.
I'm an artist, and my art is not a teaching tool about trans identity. It
Mhm.
can be, but it's not for that.
Right.
And yeah, where do I want my work to be seen? Like everywhere that art is seen, you know.
Mhm.
I think there are more fitting settings than others. You know, I love having it, you know, in an institution where we can have these sort of programming and participatory elements. I think that's really great. You know, and I would love to see it, you know, travel in different contexts, especially when we talk about these ideas of shared grief, right? Like you're talking about being in Berlin, and how is Pulse experienced in Berlin? Like how would the work be experienced in Berlin? Like I would love to see it in different contexts for that reason. Do I think that there are enough exhibitions? I mean, I think in some ways like it's really specific what this work is talking about. In other ways there's like these broader themes. But no, I don't think there's ever enough. You know, I know that Yves Laris Cohen just recently had an exhibition at MoMA. I don't know if I've ever seen a trans solo show at MoMA, right?
Mhm.
And you know, that's amazing. And it's also like not nearly enough, you know. So I think yeah, the short answer I guess would be no, you know, but there's also that tricky idea of like what gets categorized as trans art versus what just gets to be called art, which can be a tricky line to walk, you know. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Joseph and Tavia, for both your answers. And we just feel so lucky and grateful to have your work presented at the university here. I think we want to hand it off to the dancers to speak a little bit more about the act of performing the actual piece, right?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. And thank you for this juicy conversation. It's
Yeah.
lovely.
We have so many notes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you, I don't know if you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves and just like let people know what you do, what you're about. Yeah.
Sure. So, hi, my name is Chris Tabassi. I'm a non-binary Latino living in New York. I'm a dancer and a makeup artist here in the city.
And I'm Hector Serna. I am a ex-dancer, still dancing, not as actively as I used to. Not a full-time dancer anymore, but I teach yoga privately and in groups in the city, all throughout Manhattan. And yeah, we try to do some art here and there.
It was a pleasure joining Joseph in this performance. And we were lucky enough to join for the thesis and be a part of the evolution of where it is now. Yeah, it's been very lovely. I guess during back to Alyssa's original question of what it was like performing, it's been I guess it's been lovely to evolve with you in the piece throughout the presentation and how we've been interacting with the space. I don't know where to start. I guess there's so many.
I have a question about that. Just first of all, nice to meet you too.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
And I feel like, I have seen the traces of your presence, but maybe one day we'll meet face to face, Ada. But when Joseph and I were talking about this, he had mentioned that you had, one or both of you had said that it felt not exactly like a dance or something other than a dance, and so I was interested to hear more about how just to say more about that.
Absolutely. You want to touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, it was an experience for sure, and I think that there was no way to not feel anything during the piece, and just looking at it and being in the space, and yeah, the movement was not necessarily to be movement. It was to express and to feel something that was there, could be there. And, we embodied, I think, some spirits.
Some ghosts on the dance floor.
So yeah, it wasn't a dance, I don't think. It was definitely more like an experience, meditation.
Absolutely.
Connection to us and connected to something else. Not going to really promote anything about what I believe in or anything like that, but we all get that feeling of connection with others, and so yeah, it was an experience. I think I could say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love the way you kind of encapsulated it. It was very much there were elements, of course, of being trained, the habits of technique or whatever are still there, but it was a lot more of we ourselves are queer, and this is our safe space, not to use the term and too many repetitive times, but we've had so many, I guess, evolutions of identity with every time you step into a club or into a queer space, you are authentically yourself. But I guess I can't remember, I think maybe Joseph said it earlier, there is the idea of queerness is a stage, or nightlife can be escapist also, that for us, it was very much where we found our escape as dancers, as having go-go in the scene, having performed in the scene, having gone to church many times, as a good girl does. Yes, thank you. But it was very much kind of bringing authenticity to what we would see. And if you were to really cruise someone, how would you do it without I'm dancing, I'm cruising, so I'm gonna make eye contact with him, and we're gonna have some sort of element of it, and it may be authentic to me, it may be authentic to what we were saying, the ghosts that we were encapsulating, or the spirits that we were trying to lean into.
It's like a study. It was a study.
Yeah. It was,
yeah.
No, I'm just taking.
Could you talk about? I'm curious. I shared a little bit about sort of what my relationship to where I was in Pulse. Maybe that's where were you when you learned the news, and how did it impact you then, and how does working in this performing in this piece today, change or inform your memories of Pulse and its legacy in the queer community?
We were in school, yeah. We were in school.
I had just graduated from university, and
you graduated.
Yeah, I think actually when I heard the news, I had just come back from, I can't remember. What was the name? It was the name of a bar in Brooklyn. I'm forgetting. TNT, was it? Maybe no, because that one's not in Brooklyn. It looked like a hangar. It was. I don't need to date myself too much, but it was. Yeah, it was. After actually,
the Dewdrop Inn. You were at the Dewdrop Inn.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I was just coming home from a night out here, but For me, it hit differently because I had grown up. My introduction to queer spaces was back in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. That's where I was raised. So for me, it was a lot more of the religious influence within our space. We legally had no safe space. We couldn't gather in groupings without it being illegal. So it was very much, we always had that kind of solidarity. So to see it kind of spread within this idea, sadly, within such a, am I allowed to cuss? I was about to say it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna cuss. Within such a fucked up situation, it brought solace, at least from what I saw within the West here in the US, in a completely different regard. And yeah, the idea of unity has always been prevalent within our community, but I think that for me personally, having, I guess, just kind of dipping my toes out of working in the nightlife scene at that time, it hit very close to home. So being able to do this performance with my partner and with other, with such a lovely, I guess, guidance by Joseph, it really allowed us to be honest with what we were trying to bring to the piece and how we would interrelate with one another or with other people in the space. But I don't know if there's anything you would want to say.
Yeah. Well, I think I was still in school, ending school. And it just sort of changes the relationship, I think, with going out again, and what you're able to do when you go out again and how long you're able to stay out. It just creates another like stress on top of life, you know what I mean? Where you go somewhere, it used to be a place where you all that kind of sort of goes away. So yeah, I think it just was another blanket on top of our experience, and there's no way to like sort of say how to get past it, and you kind of have to just express condolences, and then as artists, I think sort of speak on it in a certain way. And I think that our identity in dance is so I feel like I identify myself in dance completely different than most of my peers out in the professional world right now, gender wise, and things like that. So it was just it was hard to sort of hear that something had happened in a place where I went to be myself and dance how I wanted to, not just how I was told to by my training and things like that. So yeah, it just changed my relationship with going out and what I did going out.
Absolutely.
And yeah.
Thank you for sharing those insights. We have another kind of question related to this, which is, I guess I'll throw it out to everyone, but how do you believe the performative/dance element of the exhibition furthers this theme of hope and absence?
Okay.
I think the question is to you, Joseph, but also maybe this is a chance for you to talk about one of the texts that you were influenced by Whitehead and Falling. Does that make sense in terms of absence and hope?
Yeah.
Or just say like, I mean, this has been an important essay to you.
I mean, it has been, yeah. It's called Expressing Life Through Loss by Anna Martine Whitehead, and it's this really incredible text that talks about like movement and dance, and particularly like responses to trauma. And she's a Black intellectual. She's talking about like Blackness and its relation to trauma in our world, but also how the body holds it, and talks about falling. She talks about falling and getting back up as like not being a white or like straight or Western timeline, and talking about like falling and getting back up as embodying many life cycles and modes. And she relates that sort of falling to the Middle Passage, and like people who would like fall off of and jump off of the boats, of the ships, but brings it back to like Vogue and like the death drop, right? Like falling and getting back up, and that sort of getting back up being sort of this element of hope, right, of picking oneself back up. We talk about like after Pulse we keep moving, right, but also disrupting the sort of ideas of life cycles and time, with embodying sort of a life and coming back to like a resurrection, if you will. As far as like hope with the exhibition, you know, I think there's a few aspects here. There's you know, having this space where we can actually have this conversation, have these sort of things happen, have these sort of like metaphor of collective care happen with the lilies. And also having this contemplative space to be able to move through these feelings together, but also in the choreography, right? It wasn't all just these, you know, melancholic movements. You know, we incorporated a lot of movements of you like embodying fun and dancing together on the floor, right? At some points you're sort of like running around and like playing with the curtain. There were lots of many like meditative and more serious parts, but there were joyful parts too. And I think that's just, you know, what the dance floor is and what life is, you know. But I think really creating enclosure to talk about these things and create them is part of it.
Yeah. Could I add on? Well, we mentioned ephemerality earlier, and you know, dance is ephemeral. It only exists once, and so you know, I think that in itself just connects to that theme of, you know, wanting or hoping for something. And you know, a lot of the movement was just naturally became something of a reach. So there was lots of reaching, a lot of like heart opening moments, a lot of like that profile that you saw of Archangel, you know, that downturned profile, things like that just makes you, you know, want to know more about what's going there. And absence, you know, the space is still present when we're not there. So we came in, we moved, we danced, we connected, we did it, you know, something, and then we can leave the space and there's, you still feel that. Yeah, so that I think is our, you know, our connection with movement and threading it to theme, bringing that to life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for the response. Oh, sorry, that's loud. I think that's our program for the night. Thank you everyone for joining tonight's program. Thank you, Joseph, Tavia, Hector, Chris, for your wonderful insights. Nothing Under Heaven is on view until December 9th. And you can find more information on our website and updates on our social media at Montclair State Galleries. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris and Agnes, for joining us. Thank you, Elizabeth.